Trigger Warning Talk podcast.
Powered by Riverside.
We're going to be discussing traumas here today with our brother, Will KESSELMANN. I want to thank everybody for joining the podcast. We're going to be streaming on all major platforms, so definitely check us out. I want to tune in for a very special conversation today. We're going to be discussing domestic violence, sexually based offenses, and trafficking. That's human and sex trafficking. This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. We do uncensored conversations. We have a bunch of information, and we provide a ton of resources that will be in the audio and the video portion of this podcast. For the video portion, you can check out Spotify, and for the audio portion, you can look at or listen to all your streaming platforms that you choose: iHeartRadio, Anchor, Amazon Music, Apple and Google Podcasts, Podbean. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. When I say we do uncensored conversations, I'm super serious about that. We're gonna have some very deep diving conversations. You guys know, for me, I always say we do the upside down iceberg. We don't talk about the 10% that you see above water. We go deep. We got our scuba gear ready. I got my brother, Will KESSELMANN, in the building. He's going to give you a bevy of information here. I'm just so excited. I finally get him on the podcast. He's part of a group that I'm involved in, which is called the Men ESN, the Empowerment Support Network. We do a lot of conversations about men's issues. We meet every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Clubhouse, or in Clubhouse, I should say. Will KESSELMANN is an expert. He is a special investigator. He deals with domestic violence. He deals with child protective services. He's a transformational coach. He deals with the court systems, the police. His CV is just too long. I'm not going to get into all that. Will KESSELMANN, what say you, brother?
Hey, LP. It's good to see you. Thank you for having me on. I truly appreciate it. And I'm glad we were able to connect.
You know, Will, the work that you do is such an important piece to not only mental health, but public health. And I always throw public health at the top. Mental health is kind of right next to it, but a little under it. And then everything else follows suit. We're going to be talking about these three things that we cover in the show. And at the end of every podcast, we cover a missing person case. And those primarily are about Black and brown men, women, and children. This missing person case that we're going to cover, the lady was found dead, but her killer's never been found. So we're going to twist it up a little bit different, because they are still trying to find out who killed this unfortunate young lady. Well, let's jump right into it. We're going to start with your work as a special victims investigator. What is that?
Okay. So what I do is, it is a division of child welfare, but it's not straight up child welfare like most jurisdictions. Most child welfare is by the county. And so what I do is, like I said, it's a division of child welfare, but we get a lot of other cases, not just child abuse and neglect. It's a lot of sex abuse, a lot of, especially recently, human and sex trafficking cases, and also domestic violence. And so I work at nights and weekends, and we respond to cases that come in. Sometimes we'll go out and the police can't show up, or the police are delayed, or just things happen. I mean, they're on a call, we're on a call, whatever the case is. So we'll go to the hospital, or we'll go to the home, we'll go to wherever, and we'll interview. We use the word survivor, even though on the police side of things, they use the word victim. So we'll go to where the survivor is, we'll speak to them, we'll, work the case. Whatever we're able to do, we do. And we try to give as much respect and dignity and empower the family, the client, the person, to empower them the most, so that they feel that someone cares, that someone sees them and hears them. And it's really important, because they've just been through a shock, a trauma, or they've been going through trauma for a long time, and they're not used to having someone truly see them, truly care about them, truly want to help. And even though I and my colleagues are there and we want to help, sometimes the person's like, well, I don't know, can I really trust them? Because maybe they've gone to police before, they've gone to child welfare before, they've gone to whichever other agency they've tried to go to. And, maybe the person didn't hear them right or whatever the case is. And, it's terrible that they didn't get the help earlier. But if I'm there and I'm able to help, that's what I try and do.
As a special investigator, what type of training did you have to earn or learn in both? And where are you located?
So I'm located in New York City. And so the work that we do is usually in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Sometimes we'll make phone calls, especially because we have a lot of cases that are interjurisdictional. I've had a lot of cases that are interjurisdictional. And there are times when we are authorized to go to a different state or county or whatever the case might be. But it's usually that we try and rely on our colleagues, whether it's law enforcement, local sheriff, etc., state troopers, whatever, or child welfare. And we rely on our counterparts to help out as well. And so we're based in New York, and we, go through the 5 boroughs, and it just depends on the night. Sometimes we're in a few boroughs, sometimes we're in one borough, sometimes we're in one neighborhood only or one hospital, because a number of cases came into one hospital. So it just depends on the night, depends on the circumstances.
I would imagine your caseload has got to be a huge volume, especially working in New York City, covering the 5 boroughs and possibly even the tri-state area. When you go and get these calls, what generally is the call like in terms of how does it come out? Do you get the call from a government agency? Do you get it from PD? Do you get it from the hospital? Because me being a first responder, a lot of times, because I'm a mandatory reporter also, I would call, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, so we called it DFS, Division of Family Service. So we called DFS, hey, I got a report as a mandatory reporter, a child abuse case that I found while I was on a 911 call. And here we go with all the information.
Yeah.
And then that information goes to an investigator. Is it the same in New York for you?
Yeah, so in New York, specific to New York, because I can talk about a lot of jurisdictions, because I do a lot of work, not just specific to New York City, but again, we have interjurisdictional situations. And so if we're asking about New York alone, there's 2 hotlines when it comes to child welfare.
Okay.
I can talk about the police side for a second as well, but for child welfare alone, there's 2 hotlines. There's mandated reporter and general public. So the mandated reporters, and that's like everybody under the sun at this point, school professionals, teachers, not the janitors, but most school professionals for the most part, most social workers, most therapists, or almost all therapists really, doctors, nurses, police, fire, etc. It runs that gamut. They have a different line and they call and they give their information. Those in the general public or those who are off duty that don't qualify as a mandated reporter, even if they're off duty. So they would call the general hotline and then give the information there. And so it streamlines through there. And we get the information and we go. There are times when, because we do what we do for so long, we get the heads up and we get a phone call. Hey, it's a police officer, a precinct cop, patrol, or it could even be a specialized officer because they have domestic violence officers in New York City. And it could be other types of law enforcement. Then they call us up and say, hey, by the way, I'm here. We just called in to the state central registers, what it's called in New York. Do you have this case, or do you know who has this case, or can you come and respond? So obviously you check with your supervisor, you follow chain of command, you do what you have to do. But there are ways that it always streamlines through the hotline, but there are ways where we can get the case as like an extra in terms of, hey, by the way, this is what's going on. Can you work it quicker or whatever? And yeah, like you mentioned before in terms of our caseload, yeah, it's busy. We don't, in my division, we don't carry cases. We work the case, and then we give it to those in the daytime who will do the follow-up. But we do all the initial stuff, all the initial interviews with all the professionals available, all the collaterals that are available, and, do what we can to not just gather information, but also empower and protect. So.
This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, sponsored by Anchor, produced by Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. We definitely want you, the listener, to know that if you are triggered at any time during this podcast, call 911, because I'm not going to show up. I'm retired. My license is still active, but I'm retired. Will Kesselman is not going to show up during this podcast. However, we do have a ton of resources available that will be in the show notes. So call 911 if you need immediate help. We have a bunch of hotlines and their associated websites. So we have the trafficking hotline and website. We have the sexual abuse hotline and website. We have the domestic violence hotline and website. I added 3 substance abuse hotlines, including for drugs and alcohol. So AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, those numbers are available, and Al-Anon. So if you are a supporter of a person with a substance abuse problem, a loved one, family friend, or what have you, you can call Al-Anon. There's a new 911 number that's going to be available nationwide in July, on July 16th, that is, of this year, 988. That's the mental health hotline emergency number for suicide issues. It is available in some states, but nationwide it will be available, and that's 988. It's not for police. It's not for fire. It's not for EMS. It's specifically a mental health hotline number. And we have a bunch of websites listed for mental health therapy that you can look for and do some research on. Will Kesselman, everybody, including myself, and your soon-to-be met Mrs. LP's sister, loves Law and Order SVU. How realistic is that show? Because we're going to talk about domestic violence, sexually based offenses, and trafficking, and they deal with those things. So how realistic is that show? Because they've been on 23 seasons now.
So it's as realistic as a TV show can be. However, there are inconsistencies, and I don't know, what I should be pointing out, but I will say that, especially when it comes to court, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do in court. One term that I will bring up is called building a foundation, which means you can't just sort of lead from question to question. You have to ask certain questions, and they sort of, in Law and Order SVU, they sort of skip some of the stuff you have to do in court. In other words, they have to ask all these different little tedious little questions, so how big is your shoe size? And would you walk with your left foot first, your right foot first? And all these different little pieces leading up to then asking the big questions. But again, it's a TV show that wants to have an emotional impact, wants to engage those who are viewing it. And I watch it myself, so don't get me wrong. I love it. But I think it's important in the sense that, and I don't mean love in that sense, but love in the sense that it's engaging, but it's also educational for people to see what goes on. And that's an important piece, is if we don't talk about this, you and I were very raw. We're very open, we're raw. We've had many conversations, many. And, please God, we'll have many, many more. And in those conversations we've had, it's been very upfront and raw in the sense that, there's nothing held back. So when we talk about Law and Order SVU, I don't think they can show all the gruesome stuff. I don't think they can say all the gruesome stuff. I don't think they can go to the X level, the next level, so to speak. Although as time goes on, the envelope gets pushed more and more. I mean, if you look at, TV in general, it used to be back in the 60s, 70s, the kind of thing, whether it's, or even maybe before that or around that time with I Love Lucy, you'd have one foot on the ground if you have a bed scene. Now, different story completely. So there's an evolution in TV. And I say that not to date myself, but I say that to actually show the proper evolution, that it was unheard of at one point to be in a bed, let alone whatever. And now it's a whole different story, and that's cool. That's all good, but there is evolution to it. And so, as they've gone through 20 some odd seasons, so I think it's 23 seasons, they've obviously given more detail, been more accurate, and given more information. And that's important. It's important for people to understand. Sometimes, though, they don't give all the info. They do follow some stereotypes. They do follow some things that people are like, oh, well, that profession, that person, that whatever. Yeah, they're like that. I guess that's for the entertainment value for TV. I don't know. I'm not an entertainer. I'm not in the TV world. But ultimately, it is quite realistic. They do skip some steps or corners or whatever, but, that's TV. The one thing I will say super quickly is that they do, not just the court aspect I said before, but they do blur some of the info when it comes to family court versus criminal court. Now, most of their interaction is in criminal court. That's great. But when they've had family court scenes, they haven't always captured, in my opinion, not all of what goes on, not all of how it looks, not all of how things play out, and that's fine. Again, it's an entertainment piece. I get that, but if you ask me the question, I'd rather explain it because court's a big deal. We rely on the court system. We rely on laws. We rely on these things to have a society that we hopefully follow the laws, and we hopefully have a safe society as best we can, and those things. And so, understanding the ins and outs of court is really important, even for someone who isn't a lawyer, because it affects us. It just does. And how, like, for example, for yourself and even for myself, it's not just how the laws are made in the state or the federal level, but how they're applied locally. That affects how, as a first responder, we may or may not do certain things, or may not say certain things, or may not follow certain order to a question, or order or questions, or order to a procedure, or whatever the case is. So laws matter. And understanding the court system matters. The court is part of law. So,
I know these shows have a lot of creative licenses, as they call it in the entertainment world, where they might blur this, they might combine these facts, they might omit certain things for either legal reasons. I know a lot of the episodes are based on real life cases, and so they change the names of the participants. They might combine a couple of characters into one character, like a lot of the movies do when they're either documentary based or more so a biopic, I would say, instead of a documentary. And so for the fans of Law and Order SVU, that life as a SVU investigator and a detective, do you see a lot of similarities in your own life in terms of some of the things that they go through personally? Because that has to affect you. I mean, we're in this game. Like, this is what we do. Well, I've retired, but this is the job that we signed up for. So you still being active, Mr. Kesselman, how does real life play into what we see on TV as an investigator?
Yeah, so it is quite reflective. It is quite genuine. So, there are longer hours. There are, non-typical hours. For example, I'm not active on dating apps right now. I made a personal commitment to not be on dating apps for a while. But we're on dating apps because we can't always, go to that concert at 8 p.m. Or we can't always, or often can't go to the concert, or often can't go to the ball game, or have tickets but can't show up because we have work obligations. We can't just say, well, you're bleeding or whatever the case is. We'll talk to you later. Now, that is obviously not how it works. There's a commitment. Those who do what we do, we are committed to help. We're committed to do what we have to when we're on shift. And the shift or tour depends on the terminology used. It doesn't always last 8 hours. It can last 12 hours or more, depending on where you work and what you do, and so on and so forth. So, even, and again, I have to speak specifically. I won't be able to comment. I have to speak in general. I apologize. I won't be able to comment on certain specifics. Yeah. But generally speaking, yeah, there is a higher rate of divorce, not just with the police and detectives, but also with child welfare and others who do investigations. Same with other first responders. There is just a different lifestyle, a quality of life aspect. I mean, a lot of my colleagues and I, we really don't want to call each other on the phone. Like a lot of our friends who don't work as a first responder in any aspect, they're like calling us on the phone, or even family calls on the phone, and they're like, well, why don't you pick up your phone? Why don't you talk to us? Well, we've been talking to people for the last, 8, 12, whatever hours. And, we just, we don't want to ignore anybody, but we just need to turn off. We need to recharge differently. And people truly don't understand that. And I respect that they don't, because it's a very different world. But at the same time, people don't. And so, we have to have that conversation where people need to realize that for us, while we are people, in other words, we're social, even if we are introverted by nature, some of us are, and that's fine, we still are social or sociable in that aspect. And we need to change, our environment, which means reading a book or doing our own thing in our room, or just watching TV, or just texting, as opposed to another phone call or another, video conversation, or whatever the case is. And it's no offense to anyone. It's just, we need that ability to decompress and turn off, and to recharge very differently than many others may. So,
as a special victims unit investigator, the work that you do regarding sexually based offenses, when you have an encounter with a person who's been sexually traumatized, what is the first steps, generally speaking, that you do when you encounter a person who's been sexually traumatized?
So in the course of my investigations, doing special victims investigations, although not for the unit on the detective side, just to make sure we're very clear, so I want to make sure that I don't blur any lines, because I'm very careful with that. Okay. So obviously we get the case, we look at the information in terms of names, dates of birth, or whatever comes to us in terms of how the case presents. We look at, who called it in and the information there, and then from there we look to see if we can get any background information or any additional information, or if there is a source, someone who called in and gave their information. In different states and different counties, there's different rules and laws and stuff. And in the South primarily, and this is just a generalization now, but in the South, you have to give your information in general. In the North, you don't always have to. You can leave anonymous reports. Again, it depends on the state, but also sometimes the county. And so if the report's anonymous in this, let's call it a hypothetical case, then obviously we have no one to call to get more information, because sometimes they'll call the hotline and they'll leave information, but maybe not all of it's captured, or the line wasn't clear, or they cut off, or who knows what. Things happen. We're human. Technology is technology. It's no one's fault. It's no particular issue, but we want to make sure that we get all that we can, because at the very beginning, gathering as much information before we go out, or if we go out, sometimes, the family already left to a different jurisdiction, and we're not going to start driving, 2, 5, whatever hours to a different state or something. We'll call them on the phone, just talk to them briefly on the phone if we can get them on the phone while they're in the car driving, and then just double check or do a well check or who knows what with our counterparts in that respective jurisdiction once they've arrived there, just to make sure that they are now safe, because maybe they were not safe in New York or not safe in different parts of the 5 boroughs or wherever, and now they're going back to family or cousins, or if they were in a foster home originally, or whatever the case is. So, those things matter. Being mindful, being aware, and properly serving, as opposed to, well, I have to do this. Well, that's not about that. It's about doing things in a way that really shows respect and care and mindfulness to the person who's gone through trauma and whatever trauma they've experienced.
How did the pandemic affect your work as an investigator? Because we know a lot of people had to shelter in place, and we know with C-19 or COVID-19, because we do uncensored conversation, how did the pandemic specifically, or let me restate it, how was your work specifically done with the shutdown happening? Because, we know that a lot of cases increase with domestic violence, sexually based offenses, with people sheltering in place because everybody's all in one place. People got cabin fever. You typically have this 8 to 12 hour gap between a person going to school, person going to work, doing whatever, and now everybody's at home. So how did the shutdown and the pandemic affect your work as an investigator?
So the honest truth is that we have a very high level of expectations in terms of our quality of work. And so for the most part, it didn't really change all that much. It could have possibly slowed us down in terms of making sure we had a mask on or making sure we took certain proper precautions for our safety when going into the emergency room or going into a hospital or going into a building. Because as we know, the rates for COVID-19 obviously were higher in hospitals with infections, but also in certain scenarios. And I think the statistics are buildings, but you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. And so we always, as first responders, have to make sure that we're safe. And other than that, we still had the same vehicles. We still had the same avenue of response. I don't know if our response times were faster, although my hunch is that it's possible that we were at the same response time level, or it was quicker, not just because there was less traffic on the roads or less people or less hoops to go through, but also in terms of just everything being streamlined, everything being there. So I don't really know that there was anything specific when it comes to an issue regarding the pandemic, other than the extra layers of safety and filling out extra paperwork when we go to various places. They want to make sure that we don't have a fever. We don't have COVID. We weren't exposed to COVID. We weren't, hitting whatever checklist issues could prevent us from going into their location. And it's for their safety. So, of course, you want to do it because you want to be respectful and you want to serve people properly, publicly, the public as well. So, there are situations where people said that, they could have done certain things. You may have read in the paper, for example, some investigators may have done video conferences or whatever. And if I had a case that had COVID, I would still ask them to come to the door, but I wouldn't have the entire interview face to face, because if they're having COVID and they're coughing or whatever, then I don't want to expose myself. And so, you can ask people some questions face to face. And then if there is a safety concern, you can possibly, depending on circumstances and getting approval from the supervisor and all these different things that I want to say, but also have to say. And so, you are able to continue the conversation on a video chat. It's like we're having now. You see my facial expression, you hear my tone of voice, you see if I'm looking at the camera or down below. It's not always easy to look at the camera because you're looking at the screen as well. It takes some getting used to. But that's the point, is ultimately you can have these conversations even by video, and they can, in my opinion, be effective. So, ultimately I don't think there was any real hit, real, negative thing. But yeah, you have to think and get creative. And I mean, one of the things I will say, actually, as a side point, is because there's less human traffic, there's less people going in and out of buildings, there's less people walking around, there's less bystanders to ask questions to. Hey, did you see this? Hey, did you see that? Less people to canvass information from, but also less people who are going in and out of buildings that can help you get in and out of buildings. So you have to get creative sometimes to find ways in and out of a building, apartment building or whatever, to be able to do your work, to try and be successful with making contact or whatever you have to do. So,
this is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. We discuss real life, real talk, and we have no qualms about giving you the rough, rugged, and raw information. I am here. I'm LP. I'm with my brother, Will KESSELMANN, a special investigator in the greater New York City area. He deals with domestic violence, sexually based offenses, human and sex trafficking as part of an investigative unit with the SVU that we know of on TV. I want to jump back to domestic violence as it relates to children. As an investigator, when you have children involved in domestic violence situations, how do you go about getting services for them in terms
That's an
of
important point.
therapy, in terms of medical treatment, in terms of, if they need to be placed in foster care? What, in generally speaking, because I know, and I have to tell the audience, Will is an active investigator, so we're not going to be able to give you all the blood and guts and all the specifics that most people want to hear about. We have to be very mindful of that because he's an active investigator. So you're going to hear me say, generally speaking, a lot. And when you can be specific, Will, the floor is yours.
I appreciate that. And you know me, I am as specific as I can be.
Absolutely.
I have no problem, giving the information that people need to hear or should hear at the very least. So, doing the investigations that I do, first off, creating the rapport with the child is very important. And that could be a number of things. It could be squatting down to their level. It could be sitting on the floor with them. It could be sitting on a smaller chair if they're in a smaller chair, depending on their age. Or if they're a teenager, respecting their boundaries, because we know teenagers don't always want to share or say certain things. And, that's just how it goes. But ultimately, being able to try and connect. And sometimes you have to say, hey, by the way, look, I have to ask these questions. You cannot respond, but there's certain things I have to ask, and there's also certain things that I would like to do. Let me know if you're okay with it. And if the person, this happens a lot, where if the child or a teen or even the adults, they realize that, oh, wait a second, he's not pushing this on me, but he does have a job to do. He's going to offer, he's going to show, he's going to demonstrate, he's going to guide, he's going to whatever. Okay, well, at least I'll hear it out. I may not want to say anything, but at least I'll be open-minded to listening. And that really is a big deal, because that listening piece changes the dynamic of how I'm accepted, but how they're accepted. And it goes both ways, right? It's me to them, but me to myself, and them to themselves, and them to me. There's different, dynamics in play. So what really matters is understanding what happened. Again, assuming the child or even the adult mentions what happened. But it's usually children that we interview, and that I interview in terms of my division and what I do. And once we understand the circumstances as best as possible, then we can begin to give information, and not just like kitchen sink stuff, like, well, we're going to give you a list of all these things, you have to do them. No, it's more a matter of, well, okay, so, you were sexually abused. Okay, so, let's make sure that you don't have any STDs or anything like that. Let's make sure that you go for a pregnancy test. The rape kit, we always encourage, but people don't always want the rape kit to be done. We let the hospital staff in those situations do what they do in terms of talking or encouraging, or social workers on call, or whatever the case is. They'll interview the child or adult or whatever the circumstances are as well. But ultimately, we explain that for us to be able to do our jobs, we do need certain things, but we don't force. There's absolutely no reason to force or come across as strong. And so that's something that I cannot stress enough. And when the survivor sees that, oftentimes they'll say, look, I'll give you some information. Or they'll give us yes or no answers to certain things and eventually stop. And that's fine. And so once we get enough information, we're like, okay, so, if the person needs anger management, if they have an anger issue, which is not usually the case for someone who's been sexually or humanly trafficked or sexually assaulted or whatever, but let's say there is anger issues, or they have anger too for whatever reason, so we will make the appropriate referral. New York City has a very deep system of services. And there are other places where there's less services, but when we will make those phone calls. Like if we have cases where the family was in New York and the assault, the abuse, the situation happened in New York, we'll still call our counterparts in New Jersey, for example, or other states, for example. But sometimes those states won't necessarily take the case, or they can't do all the work. So we'll literally go into the zip codes or the counties that are neighboring where the family lives, or where the child lives, or the woman or dad, or whatever the case is, where they are, and we'll try and find them. We do find them a list of services. If they're outside of our jurisdiction, we give them that information for them to make the phone calls, for them to get it. Some services are free, paid for by whether it's federal or state or other grants or money or programs. And some services are through a person's, person's health insurance. So it depends. Oftentimes it's just easier for the client to call themselves, and we'll follow up a day or two later. Hey, by the way, you make the phone call. Hey, how did it go? Hey, were they able to help you? And also encouraging them, if they haven't called yet, to encourage to call, but also when they call, not just say or take no for the answer, but say, hey, by the way, do you know of another agency nearby that might be able to help, or someone else that does, or a private therapist that does, or a private individual or professional, or whatever the case is. Because oftentimes, even if you're calling one person, that next sort of derivative or that next ripple effect kind of person can be that resource that probably you need if the person you're calling directly can't. So it really is a matter of sort of breaking everything down, understanding what went on. Sex abuse has a very, in my opinion, different way of approaching it, where you go a little slower, calmer is the wrong word, but it's a different approach where you really, really have to build that rapport. It's so important. And again, not just anger management, but there could be counseling. And again, not all counseling is the same, right? So there's trauma-informed counseling, there's general therapy, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, and it goes on and on and on and on, EMDR and so on and so forth. Sure. And then there's also understanding, each one and what the benefits and pros and cons and everything else are. And that has to also be explained to the person who's been through the trauma, the survivor, because they're going to ask questions. So you yourself have to do some of the research, you proverbial, have to do some of the research to get the information to be able to explain on some level, hey, this is what it might look like, but ask them all these questions because they're great questions, and I'm not the professional who's in that location, in that specific field. So, and when it comes to, and this is important because we still have this now, when it comes to not just the pandemic, but even now, the backlog of people on waiting lists. The waiting lists problem is a huge problem. In fact, you and I have had conversations off of not just this platform, but off of other platforms where we've talked about, and I believe you're still working on, getting a database, a list of mental health providers, state by state, county by county, area by area, which is so important because there are providers in different counties within the same state who might be able to provide the service through telehealth, through video services. Okay. Some states you can't do that. Other states you can. And some states, I don't remember if there is a state still, but I know at one point there were a few states that were allowing their professionals to do therapy even outside their state remotely, if I remember correctly. So those things are important because not everyone has access. Not everyone has access to services. Sure. If you're in a large city, there's the demand is higher, and so being creative, being open-minded, and really trying to find ways to get someone the help that they want and need, but they also have to want it. So, that's a bit about that. So I just wanted to point that out because the waiting list is still a huge deal.
For me, I think about New York City as being the Mecca. It's the country's largest city, 10 million people in the metropolitan area. I want to talk about trafficking because I presume that New York is number one in the U.S. for traffic, just because of all the ports, people coming in and out, the two major airports you have. I could be wrong, but I doubt it. I want to ask you as the expert, is New York City the trafficking mecca of the U.S.?
I'd have to double check, but I don't think that it is actually. I think it's high up there. I think the trafficking numbers are higher, believe it or not, in the South. I believe Texas, Arizona, Florida. Yeah, because you have a lot of the those who aren't documented, who come in and they're being human and sexually trafficked from other countries, and they don't know it yet, or they're being groomed, or they do know it already. It depends where they are in that process. And look, New York is high, don't get me wrong, the highest rate in an airport is actually Atlanta, Georgia, Hartsfield-Jackson.
Yeah.
So, in terms of that, whenever I travel through Hartsfield-Jackson, I'm always looking around. I never usually see anything. But, you're always looking around because once you've done the job long enough, you can't turn certain things off. But at the same time, we talk about numbers. New York is high. So basically, everything along the border is high. Now, the Canadian border, much, much less. But everything along the border. So, and ports. So, yes, ports of entry for New York. Ports of entry, I mentioned Florida, I mentioned Texas, I mentioned Arizona. California has, because you can also come in through LAX and some of the other airports from the Asian communities that aren't documented. And there are high rates there too, as well as, and especially Seattle. Seattle has high rates as well. Again, I don't have the statistics on me. I apologize for that. I can find it out and give it to you after. And you can post it. But I know that New York, I don't believe New York is number one. I believe that it's either Arizona, Texas, or Florida, somewhere over there. That's number one, and then the rest cascade from there.
The reason I posed that question is because here on the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, I like dispelling the myths. I like getting rid of the stigmas, the taboos, and the stereotypes associated with domestic violence, missing persons, sexually based offenses, and human and sex trafficking. That's part of our core goal, is to dismiss, talk about, eliminate, resolve anything that is some bullshit when it comes to what people perceive to be truth. I say there's a difference between truth and facts. We know 1 + 1 is 2. That's a fact. LP is the greatest guy in the world. That's my truth. Will Kesselman may not believe that, though. I don't think he does not believe that, but I'm just saying. So when we talk about truth versus facts, I like pointing that out to the guests that I'm talking to because you're the expert. Most of the conversation that we're going to have is going to be you talking. So when we talk about trafficking, here's what I want to know from you, because I did a podcast a couple of episodes ago where I highlighted a case about a young girl in Texas who went to an NBA basketball game with her dad. This was in Dallas. Major NBA city, major NBA stadium. Went to the bathroom. She was 15 years old. And this is, and the reason I'm covering this is because we only think about trafficking involving foreigners, non-U.S. residents. This story was different. And so she's 15 years old. She's at an NBA game in Dallas with her dad. She tells her dad she needs to go to the restroom. She goes to the restroom by herself. The next time the dad sees her is 11 days later. He contacted the police a couple of hours after she didn't show up from the bathroom. They did their investigation. Dad wasn't satisfied with what was going on. He contacted a trafficking organization. I think it was in Houston or San Antonio. I can't remember right offhand, but a couple hours away. They did their research based on the demographics he gave them. You know where they found her? Found her in Oklahoma City. She was being sold and trafficked to a bunch of men at this hotel in Oklahoma City. And I'm sitting there like, so this woman was kidnapped or abducted, either one. She was trafficked. She was missing. She was sexually offended. Like all in one whop. She didn't come from, some Eurasian area. She didn't come from Central America or something like that. She didn't come from Mexico. She was right here in the U.S. of A. How much do you see domestically? How much domestically do you see in terms of trafficking in your line of work?
We see a lot, but at the same time, and this may sound a bit strange, but it's true, not everyone being sexually humanly trafficked is going to try and give hints because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they try to say something. If they try to get free and the person who controls them. There's different names for it. I'm not going to use the names. There's different names or whatever. But the person who controls them, or the network of men, usually men who control them, they will go to very extreme lengths to get their quote-unquote product. I don't like the word. I'm making sure we're clear, because they view it as a product. They view it as a service. They view it as something that they can sell to make money. And it's disgusting, but that is what they think, how they think. As a side point, I did pull it up. There's a word population review site that has what seems to be accurate information. And so based on population, not just numbers, but based on population, meaning for X number of people in that state, this is the amount of cases per 100,000 people. Believe it or not, Nevada is number 1, Mississippi is number 2, Florida is number 3, Ohio is number 4, Georgia is 5, Delaware is 6, believe it or not, Delaware, yes. California is 7, Missouri is 8, Michigan and Texas. I knew, and California, according to what was I just picked up, California is often high up there on the list. So the issue isn't how often do we see it. The issue is how often do we pick it up? How often do we catch it? And it's not easy to catch. And I mentioned before about rapport. Rapport is huge. Oftentimes, it's not that one time you're speaking to that teen, child, young adult, whatever. It's often that they find a way to get a hold of you in the future, and you've said something or built rapport or done something that allows the person being sexually or humanly trafficked to feel that connection, because they need to want to leave.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. So for them to be on their list, it's something that I've known about for a while. I didn't realize they were that high up. And I'm telling you, like, because Interstate 70 starts at Baltimore, Maryland, and it goes all the way through to Colorado. Missouri is right along that path. So I know all about Interstate 70 because I used to live off of Highway 70 in Shreve in St. Louis, and that's in North City. I didn't realize how much the pipeline of the highways was being utilized for trafficking until I started doing a lot of research on it. Because again, most people think trafficking, they think, well, somebody's being put in some shipping containers from Europe and being put on a boat and being brought into these ports, or they're coming from across the U.S.-Mexico border in a bunch of vans or trucks or something like that. Now, those things do happen. However, the highways are really, really being used as the main source of transport from point A to point B. When we talk about trafficking, how much would you say the ratio is from kids to adults?
Oh, okay. So that's actually a very important topic. So, and these are public numbers. Nothing is hidden or whatever. I want to make sure that's very, very clear. So there is, and I'd have to get the actual source. I'd have to find it again, but there is an actual source where. So you asked. Let me stick to your question first. So in terms of the numbers, I don't have the raw number, the specific number, but my understanding is that it is more so children, more so, let's call them people. So people under the age of 21, especially.
Okay.
Because as disgusting as it sounds, those who want to do disgusting things, let's just make sure we're very clear about this. They want younger, quote unquote, prettier, whatever they want to say, however they want to say it. And, there's nothing pretty about this. So that's why I said quote unquote, to make sure we're very, very clear.
Absolutely.
And so, unfortunately or terribly or whatever, more intense word we can use, it is usually younger as opposed to older. And so another thing I wanted to mention, and where I cut myself off before, but I'll mention this now, is So let me make sure we're clear. So not every child who comes in contact with child welfare or who comes in contact with the police or any other agency then comes in contact with child welfare, not all those kids end up in foster care. Okay, so depends on the state, depends on especially the county, because child welfare is run by the county. Okay, so if we assume, give or take, a 10% to 20% rate of children who come in contact with child welfare end up in foster care, and again, I'm just using general numbers here. I'm not being specific on purpose. But if that's a general number that we're using, and then of that, let's say 20% of kids who come in contact with child welfare, or even 10%, then you're talking about 8 in 10 of those kids, sometimes as high as 8.8 if you can split a child. I'm not sure you can, but if we use the 100 mark, so 88 out of 100 or 80 out of 100, so 80 to 88% of kids in foster care end up going either AWOL or some sort of bad path, if you will, and end up being sexually and humanly trafficked. And it's a huge issue. And because I understand the child welfare system very well, as you know, part of how we first met really was this actual conversation. You may actually recall this, where I mentioned the stat and you're like, wait a second. And you're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, this is for real. And so 80 to 88% of kids in foster care, remember, not kids who come in contact with child welfare, but in foster care, end up sexually and humanly trafficked. Usually the numbers are 12 to 14-year-olds. Again, this is in general. And usually the kids are either LGBTQIA or some experimentation of sexuality, something where they could be quote unquote straight, as we call it today, but they could also be different sexual orientations. And that's also a flag. So whenever I come in contact with different populations, different backgrounds, I'm mindful to not be sort of like annoying with questions or overly whatever with questions, but I will try and ask certain questions as chilled out, as calm, as sort of under the radar kind of deal, to just see where things are. Because if the answer comes across as questionable, not clear cut, they're fine, then I know I want to at least build rapport. But forcing the issue is never the right way to handle it, unless they're like dying in the air, or there's like a weapon to their head. Or I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's gradients to all this. You have to assess it for what it is and have everything sort of assessed the right way. But that is the point: is understanding that not the child welfare system, the foster care system is a huge issue, and part of my proprietary method through what I do as a consultant, because I'm here, I do investigations, wonderful, I'm able to help, that's great, but I make no bones about transitioning to being a consultant, and my company is called Control and Power Strategy, because we try and take back first our control and then our power. Because in the literature, whether it's domestic violence or any aspect of someone having their voice and power taken away, first it's their power and then control taken away. So an abuser in domestic violence in the literature, in the articles, paperwork, whatever, it's usually power and control that they perpetrate. And so I try and flip that script of giving a person back their control and then ultimately achieving their power. So when we talk about not just the rapport aspects, but also in terms of, children in foster care, other situations, it's very important for them to see that they do matter. You do see, hear, and feel them. And that they, how do I explain this? That they do have control over their lives and there is a sense of power. They don't usually see it because they've been dominated, suppressed, smothered, controlled, isolated a lot for a prolonged period of time, or they're being groomed, and all of those pieces and more apply to how they're being treated. And so by showing them that there is another avenue, there is another way, there is someone out there who's showing them a different light, or the light sometimes, that is 110% very important. And you mentioned the routes on the highways. Truckers, by the way, take a lot of pride in trying to help when it comes to human and sex trafficking and calling in to 911 and trying to stop it if they can, or being aware. So, I do give my hat off to truckers, because truckers are very important in sometimes spotting or calling it in or whatever the case is. So.
That's really great to know, and shout out to the truckers who are in the foxhole with you, trying to curb or striving to curb this epidemic. I want to ask a very sensitive question. At the end of every podcast, we cover a missing person case, and 99% of those cases are Black and brown men, women, and children. When you encounter these investigations, or when you're playing a part in these investigations, how does the race factor play a part of that? Because I'm just seeing a lot of these missing persons cases, they're really just strange, to say the least. Like, some of them just don't make any sense. We're finding some of these people dead and their organs are missing. We're finding some of them where they're somewhere totally where they weren't when they were found missing, or when they became missing. As well as, we know that a lot of media attention does not go to these individuals. This is part of the reason why we cover missing persons, including kidnappings, abductions, and runaways. As an investigator, what do you see being this disparity between how investigations are being done? And I'm not casting any aspersions against you. I'm just saying, overall, we know that there's a huge divide between Black and brown, as well as non-Black and brown, media coverage and attention to the plight of these missing persons.
Yeah. So let me start off by saying this. What you're saying is real. What you're saying is raw and important. I do want to say that I'm from Montreal, Canada originally, so I have a very different perspective.
Okay.
I'm also Jewish, and I take that seriously in the sense that Jews also, I'm not comparing, I'm just simply saying that there are situations where Jews are, and I have in myself, confronted 3 people, 4 people against me in a corner in the basement of a large university, where it's either I defend myself or that's it. And I'm called, racial slurs and whatever. And my point is it helped me be more mindful. Am I perfect? No. I have to always learn and ask questions. We have those conversations too, where I'm learning from others and learning information and understanding more. Granted. So when you ask about things happening, negative, bad things, terrible things happening to Latinx, African Americans, Black and brown populations, I would go as far as saying that, and this is a generic thing to say, and I hear, and I see, and I realize this, that a lot of it does have to do with socioeconomics in terms of access to whatever it might be, access to a job, access to school, access to whatever, and not having the lack of a parent in the home, because your mom, it's a single parent household, and the mother has to work 2 jobs. So the kid's alone, and the kid can get influenced, whether it's through video games, which is a whole topic in and of itself, in terms of human and sex trafficking. It's a very big deal, especially as NFTs and metaverse and things come out in that way. But also, in the community where, in some situations you don't want to snitch, you don't want to say anything, you want to keep things in house, whether it's getting stuck into a gang, there's pressures in schools.
Hold on, Will. Go back to your last sentence, because there was a lag. Sure.
So I'll repeat from the very beginning of this in terms of talking about the video games. The video games, kids, so if the mom or dad, but let's say it's a single parent, and the mom is a single parent, and the mom has to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs or whatever the number of jobs are, and she's not home. And so the child can get influenced by, kids in the community, possibly the pressures of being sucked into a gang at school, because this happens more than people realize, where children don't really have much of a choice for the school part of it. If they resist, they get beat or worse, or severely beaten or whatever. And so there's all these pieces that children in lower socioeconomic situations, in other words, the lack of access to a job, the lack of access to school, the lack of access to whatever, a safe, neighborhood. The more the population is, the more in a building you are, the more people are there, the more likely you are people to just have one person who isn't a good person or isn't doing good stuff. So there's that piece, but then we take it one step further. So with the video games, children can get very easily influenced, can get groomed, really. Girls for sexual abuse, boys and girls for human sex trafficking as well. And, the mom or dad thinks, okay, they're just playing video games. But they don't realize they're playing online with somebody else. And that person's talking back to them. And they're having conversations and they're building rapport and they're being groomed. So the video games is extremely important. Now, I'm trying to think what else I was getting at before. And there was that lag. I think I was also talking about...
You said something about the NFTs.
I don't remember. Yes. So with the metaverse and NFTs, then it's a whole different world, really. And it is a world, but in the sense of bad things happening, it's a different world where a child can get groomed there too. And it happens not just in the video games. The video games now are leading into NFTs. They're leading, well, not the NFTs itself. I'm sorry. The video games are leading into the metaverses. So each company may have a metaverse, like Sony may have one, others may have one, or there may be metaverses that incorporate video games, or its own video game has a separate metaverse. And those things aren't really patrolled. There isn't a police force. There isn't a whatever. And so parents, it's so important as a parent, whether the child has money or the family has money or doesn't have money, it's so important for the mom, the dad, whoever, to ask questions. Are you playing the game against the computer or the machine, or are you playing against somebody else? And are you talking to them? And who are you talking to? And people, especially those who want to groom and do bad things, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm 16. Oh yeah, I'm 14. Oh yeah, I'm whatever. And then eventually they'll try and meet up with the child. So it's usually a child or a teen. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, Johnny or Jane or whoever they were quote unquote talking to, or they thought they were talking to, isn't available, but I'm here for them. And that's how they begin to shift all of that. That's how they begin to shift all of that and change how things go. So it's really important that people are aware that the metaverse isn't patrolled. Video games aren't patrolled. A lot of places, there's very few protections. And yes, it happens more so to people of color. I'll say people of color in general. Even to LGBTQIA, those who are white, the LGBTQ. Because unfortunately, people aren't given enough respect, aren't given enough equal power. And it's something that I see every day. And it affects me terribly. And it's part of the work that I do. I do want to help empower. And ultimately, my goal is to create a separate not-for-profit that does help and empower the people of color community, the POC community, because they are disproportionately affected by the foster care rates, the human sex trafficking rates, the disappearance rates. Oh, and the last very, very important piece that I do want to throw in here, so please forgive me, because I know we had a certain agreement on time, was you had mentioned the child is found without organs, or the adult is found without organs. They're missing kidneys, they're missing liver, whatever the case might be. So I don't know of a statistic like this, but in terms of the anecdotal stuff that I'm seeing over time, is that the biggest issue facing our world, not just America, but our world for this century, isn't the drugs, it isn't the gangs, it isn't the guns, it isn't the money laundering, it's not any of those things. It's going to be the stuff that cannot be tagged, cannot be monitored, cannot be there's no way to barcode it Although now there are ways to put chips inside people, but that's a whole other topic. And so if you can't barcode a person and you can't barcode organs, it makes it easier, which is why, the what's it called? The cryptocurrencies originally were at one point used a lot by criminals because there wasn't tracking. Now there's more and more tracking, and there's ways to do it, so there's less of that. But ultimately, people can't be tracked. Organs can't be tracked. Body parts can't be tracked. And if you can't track it, it's easy for someone, whether it's a gang, mafia, whatever, to take it and use it because they need money to fuel their enterprise. And so this, in my opinion, will be the biggest issue going forward for this century and possibly even the next number of centuries, is for crime and organized crime to find ways of doing things that really has no way of being tracked at all. And you can't really track people like that. You can track their phone. You can track their spending on a credit card. You can track their bank interaction, but you can't really track the person. And that's a huge, huge deal when we talk about sex, human trafficking, sex abuse, and domestic violence.
What conversations do you have with other investigators when it comes to the application of giving the same energy and coverage to those disenfranchised communities, those victims, those individuals that are Black and brown? Like, are you talking to them and saying, hey, you know what? This is not right. Like, we need to do more because this person, not necessarily more in regards of, hey, we're going to focus more on Black and brown folks than white folks. Like, what are your conversations with your colleagues when it comes to just the application of your job? Because there are these disparities in terms of the investigations. Like, I'm just being real. I'm just being honest. How do you talk to your other colleagues about increasing the awareness and giving the same energy to those cases where there are Black and brown folks? And again, this is not against you. I'm not questioning you. I'm just asking you a question, brother.
No, I hear you. So I view all cases equally. I often get into trouble verbally with
not
my supervisors when it comes to. No, I'm explaining. I'm explaining.
No,
I have no problem explaining. Sometimes I'll take. Yeah. Sometimes I'll take extra time on cases. They're like, "Well, why are you taking so much time on this case?" I'm like, "Because it's needed." They're like, "But why? You've all these other situations going on, or you've got 8 cases for the night, and so on and so forth." So I'm like, "But we need the extra half hour because this and this and this and this," and they usually back off. They usually like, "Okay, fine, but please hurry up," kind of thing. And so I address some of the key points. And if need be, I'll call them on the phone while I'm driving to the next location with my partner or whatever the case is. So I think, and I don't think, I know for a fact, and it's publicly stated on websites and stuff, it's public knowledge, where whether it's New York or other states or even other counties, where they are very mindful of trying to decrease the amount of children in foster care, decrease the amount of children who need services or who have to get involved in certain ways with the system, because ultimately the better outcomes are children who are with their families when they're safe. The children are better with their own families when they're safe. And so, there is a lot of training and a lot of information that's being given where we do and we're told of the statistics about disproportionality. In other words, those who are Black and brown, those who are POC, people of color, those who are LGBTQIA, all these different communities that have higher rates specific to them, that we need to be aware of these things, mindful of these things, but also make sure that we're not doing something in a way that is aggressive or pushes them away or whatever, because ultimately people are people and they have to feel, again, seen, heard, and felt. And so everyone has a different way of being seen, heard, and felt, but we also have some commonalities too. And so that's where I, myself, and my colleagues who I work with, we try to really, be human in that way of meeting someone where they are and really trying to build rapport, if nothing else. And is it perfect? No. Are we rushed? Sometimes, yes. Is there situations that happen? Yes. But at the same time, there are techniques, like I mentioned, of calling them afterwards or calling them on video chats or whatever, just to make sure the rapport is either established, reestablished, built the right way, whatever the case is. So, there are ways to handle it. And I would say more and more, the majority of states and the majority of counties are aware of issues. It's often said that it's socioeconomic. In other words, money and where one lives and those kinds of things. Ultimately, though, we know and we see, and this is just my opinion, we know and we see that it is people of color, LGBTQIA, people of those communities who identify with those communities who may not get or they may not have their story put on the news right away. They may not have information put in the paper right away. They may not have the police respond right away. They may, get the "you must wait 24 hours" thing. Mm-hmm. And so those things are important. Those statistics, those numbers, those aspects are important. And the more we talk about it, the better it is for everyone, not just those of color, because it takes everyone. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes everyone to help each other out. We're all interconnected. We're all very interconnected. There's I forget the name of the movie. I got a bunch of awards. I think it's called Traffic. I could be wrong. And it came out a while ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago. And it's just different stories that one affects the other and one plays into the other. That's life.
Traffic. Right. Traffic. Yeah.
It was Traffic, right?
Yeah, Traffic.
Yeah, it's a good movie. People should see that. Yeah.
You know what I thought about when you were talking about the video games? I thought about a story that I just read where there's a thing going around now where adults are, I guess, playing a role as a kid, these video games where they interact with each other, and they're getting these actual minors. These adults are perpetrating themselves as minors, and they're talking to actual minors, and they're getting them to show body parts and take pictures and all this stuff. Then they're coming at them saying, "Hey, I'm not really who I said I was. I'm an adult." And they're blackmailing these kids and saying, "Hey, you need to give us money or some access to some financial windfall, or we're going to put this information out. We're going to show your pictures. We're going to expose you to the world on something that's most private to you, and that's your body." Are you seeing those cases rise?
Or you have to come with us because we want to hang out with you or whatever. Or sometimes they don't even say their real identity. They're like, "Okay, well, I'm now going to use your photo against you. I'm going to put it on the internet. Or I'm going to show your parents, or I'm going to put it all over your community." Or where they coerce the children. Often it's children, often it's teens, to give information about their family, their mom, their dad, their parents, their cousins, relatives, whatever. And then they can blackmail those people. They can use those identity for identity theft and fake identities and stuff like that. There's different ways that can be done. We see those cases. It used to be a long time ago when I first started that they weren't that common. Now we see this, I would say, more often. I don't have the actual numbers, but anecdotally, it is way more often. Instead of maybe being once a month or once whatever, or if at all once a year, way back when, now it could be, once a month, once every 2 months, or more frequent. Depends on just the flux of cases and how things are going. And again, it's the same statement I said before about things that are very hard to be tracked. Yes, you can track a photo, you can track it to an extent, You can track all those things, but at the same time, there isn't still. You can still get to the person who has the actual stuff, the photo or whatever, and that's really a key issue. That's really a key concern, is putting pressure, grooming, and ultimately getting what the perpetrator wants out of the other person, taking away their power and control, and doing what they want afterwards. So, and again, it's not just the blackmail stuff. And blackmail is important. Don't get me wrong, but it could be other things. It could be, so and so, such and such. You have this at a third, or I want your shoes, or there's a whole bunch of stuff that it could be.
I'm going to have you back as a regular contributor, like quarterly, because we got to do some follow-ups on some of these topics. And, this stuff is just dynamic. It's not static. It's ever-changing. It's ever-evolving. And we want to keep people in the loop because, whether you're talking about domestic violence, sexual-based offenses, human and sex trafficking, the way that they're utilizing technology, whether it's the metaverse, whether it's crypto, NFTs, video games, virtual reality. And I always tell parents, stop acting like you or your kid's friend. You are their parent. You are their caregiver. I told my kids, I will never, ever, ever be your friend. I can be friendly with you. We can hang out and do stuff, but I will always be your parent. Once you hit 18 and older, I'm still going to be your dad, but I'm more of a mentor from that perspective. And I just give you information and I put the ball in your court. We have to be aware of what's going on with our kids. Almost every kid, just like almost every adult, has access, if not their own smart device, be it an iPad, be it an Android, be it an iPhone, a smartwatch, a computer, whether it's a tablet or a laptop or a desktop. And they're playing these games and they're communicating on this worldwide network, which is awesome. I love video games. I love playing certain games and joining these communities, and we're talking and we're playing missions and all this stuff. However, everybody's not above board. And these kids are isolated so much in their rooms and with their friends, and parents are too scared to go in their kids' rooms and all this stuff, like the kid owns the room. It just leads to these situations a lot of times that you end up investigating. And I'm sure you come across this stuff all the time, every day, and probably twice on Sunday. And I can only imagine how you're like, man, this probably could have been prevented if this person was a little bit more involved. Man, this probably could have been prevented if this parent would have just checked to see who they're talking to. Maybe just sat in the room with them while they were playing this game, not necessarily with a headset on, but, just why, because some of this is not audio, some of it is text in the game, chat. And so we're going to have you come back and talk more in detail about the games, the video games and the virtual reality, and how they're being utilized in human and sex trafficking. How can people get in touch with Mr. Will Kesselman if they want to have any questions, comments, or concerns answered?
Sure. So I'm on the internet. The company, the company that I have, that I'm the president and founder of, is called controlandpowerstrategy.com. You can find me on all social media, whether you type in Control and Power Strategy or you type in the short version, which is CP Strategy. You can find it on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I will soon be doing TikTok and YouTube videos. And you can also find me on an app called OWL, OWWLL, which is a connector app. And you can basically call an expert and within 10 minutes or less get some information on what you're looking for, as opposed to having to go on LinkedIn or others and trying to connect and everything else. So you can, get a hold of me there. You can get a hold of me on my website. The website has a link, like almost at the very beginning. It's a little box that says get into contact or reach out to us, and just send me a message. And once you send a message, another message then gets sent back to you that says, okay, here's a way to do a 15-minute consultation to ask me questions, or if there's concerns, whatever. And primarily the service that I offer as a consultant, I do coaching as well, but as a consultant, the consulting services are domestic violence, divorce. So divorcing someone, it's dealing with the courts, dealing with child welfare, dealing with police, dealing with even one's own therapist, and not having one's therapist railroad them in court because the abuser, the perpetrator is like, oh yeah, this woman's crazy, or he's crazy, or whatever, and they shouldn't have the kids, or there has to be 50-50 split for the kids, or other ways of basically shutting down and stopping, preventing the court being used for financial abuse and being dragged on, or court orders that shouldn't have been there in the first place. And there's all these different pieces to it, even children being abused in school. And so, again, you can reach out to me, Control and Power Strategy, all one word, Control and A-N-D, powerstrategy.com. And my phone number I'll even give out here. The company number is 573-427-7277, 573-427-7277. You can text or call that number. There's other numbers that are more local to you, but that's the general number you guys can call as well. LP, thank you very much for having me. I do appreciate it. It's always a privilege. Thank you very, very much. Seriously.
I know that was a little cheesy. I'm just playing with these sound effects, Will. So, no, seriously, brother, I want to thank you so much for your time. We're going to have links to your contact information in the show notes. Again, if you are triggered by anything that you heard during this podcast, call 911 for starters. And if you don't need an immediate need, but you want to talk to somebody about domestic violence, human and sex trafficking, sexual abuse, domestic violence, if you have substance abuse issues, including drugs and or alcohol, we have all of those numbers that are going to be listed in the show description, just like we do for every podcast that we do. So check us out. Will, until next time, my friend, I want to wish you peace and blessings always.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
All right, folks, we're going to move to the last part of every podcast. As we always do, we talk about a missing person case. This missing person case actually was partially solved because this young lady was found and she was dead, but her killer or killers have never been found or brought to justice. I want to talk about her, and her name is MITRICE Richardson. I got a story that Mrs. LP sent to me because she's our resident missing persons specialist. This comes from abc7.com. And let me pull it up. MITRICE Richardson, she vanished on the night of September 17th in 2009. 24-year-old Cal State Fullerton graduate was released from jail at the Malibu Lost Hill Sheriff Station around midnight. She had nothing but the clothes on her back. She had no money, no purse, no cell phone, no car, and no way to get home. So we're going to play the audio and the video portion of this interview from abc7.com.
Today, the LA County Board of Supervisors is going to be considering increasing the reward offer for any information into the death of MITRICE Richardson. You may remember on September 7th of 2009, Richardson was released from the Malibu Lost Hills jail. 11 months later, the 24-year-old's remains were found in a canyon near Malibu, and her death still remains a mystery. The Board of Supervisors initially offered a $10,000 reward for information for Richardson's disappearance. That reward was brought back in 2010, and again late last year. It is set to expire Sunday.
So I want to let everybody know that there is some information on MITRICE Richardson on a number of websites. DailyNews.com has some information on her. You can Google her, MITRICE, MITRICE, Richardson, common spelling. The DailyNews.com again has information on her, and Wikipedia did an article on the death of MITRICE Richardson that's pretty in depth. Again, her kidnappers or murderers or both have never been brought to justice. So we always want to bring attention to missing persons cases. And, this was a little different because we normally just cover those cases of Black and brown, kidnapped, abducted, runaways. This is the first time that we've done a case where the person was actually found and they were deceased, but their captor, their murderer has not been brought to justice, and we don't know who that person or those persons are. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. My guest, Will Kesselman, he's always a great asset, has great information. Again, we're going to have this information linked into the show description. Remember, live in awareness, never live in fear. Keep your head on swivel. Situational awareness is important. Mental health crisis is the world's oldest continuous pandemic that's been around since the beginning of mankind, and it affects us all. We all have experienced trauma on one level or more. You've either seen it, received it, or given it. And we're talking about trauma. We talk about how domestic violence, sexually based offenses, human and sex trafficking, and missing persons, they all fall under the mental health umbrella, under public health. And so, again, I want to thank you all. This podcast will be streamed on all major platforms. And until next time, peace and blessings be upon you forevermore. LP out.